So is the UFC or MMA in decline? A lot of that is overstated. Fighters today have better best practices. They understand preparation better. They understand weight cutting better. In a certain sense, they're as good as they have been. In fact, I would even argue certain divisions are truly as good as they ever have been, right? I would say something like 145 pounds is probably a good example of something like that. Although obviously missing Jose Aldo doesn't really help. But you get the idea. Like there's plenty of interesting things happening in some of those lighter weight divisions. But that's really not the case in some of the heavier divisions. In fact, I would argue 205 pounds has suffered a noticeable decline. Now, I got asked previously on a live chat, hey, is 205 as good as it's ever been? Is there a renaissance? Not only is there not a renaissance, I would argue we're in the dark ages almost of 205 pounds. Now, you could maybe find a slightly different time. You could probably pinpoint, 2018, 2019, early 2020, like pre-pandemic, you could probably say some of that was a little bit different. It's really somewhat a matter of interpretation, but I want to go into this argument here a little bit. And as I mentioned, because of modern best practices, in a certain sense, fighters are better than they ever have been. They're dealing with, again, they know how to cut weight better. They know how to prepare better. They've got a better sense of what works and what doesn't relative to fighters from 5 and certainly 10 or 15 years ago. That is true. There really no is denying that. So in that sense, fights are better. But I want to show you a graphic. It is July of 2024, okay? What if we took a look at what the light heavyweight division was in July of 2014? So 10 years ago this month. What did the UFC light heavyweight division look like, and what can we infer from that? I'm going to look at my screen here, but let's put the rankings up here. Now, you can find different rankings that might have a little bit different in terms of where they would go. This one I pulled from MMA Mania. But this is what light heavyweight looked like in 2014. You had, as a champion, Jon Jones. Number 1 contender, Gustafsson. Number 2, DC. Then you had Rashad Evans, Glover Teixeira, Anthony Johnson, Phil Davis, Dan Henderson, Ryan Bader, Shogun Rua, Ovince St. Preux, Jimmy Manuwa, Rafael Cavalcanti, Vitor Belfort, the Little Nog, Antonio Rogerio Nogueira, and then Fabio Maldonado kind of bringing up the rear there. Okay, fair enough. So that's what it looks like. What can we say about that? On this list in 2014, you had the best to ever do it, Jon Jones. You had the second best to ever do it in Daniel Cormier. You had, in the case of, go down here, Phil Davis, a Division I national champion out of Penn State. Ryan Bader, multiple Big Ten champion, 2-time All-American out of Arizona State. And Mauricio Shogun Rua, you had a previous champion and the 2005 Pride Grand Prix middleweight winner. I can go in some other directions. How about Dan Henderson, your 2-time Olympic team member? And there's other ones I could list here as well. Look on this list as well. We have Rashad Evans, who was a champion in this weight class briefly. We have Glover Teixeira, who became a champion in this weight class. We have Dan Henderson, who was a 2-time champion out of Pride before he ever got there. As I mentioned, Shogun was a previous champion. Vitor Belfort, a previous champion. And we can go on down the list from there. Guys, look at this list. Look at this list and understand what I'm trying to point out here. 205 was clearly better back in the day. Clearly better. Now, I would actually argue by 2014, it's not long after this, where it really begins to accelerate into a more declined version. This is somewhat the last gasp of what it once was, or some of the better days. Okay, fair enough. This is not to say that we weren't soon there and declined thereafter. But look at what we have here. Best ever, second best ever, a 2-time Olympian, national champion, Division I, All-American Division I, guys who had come from other organizations who had been either champions there or had done incredible work in those places, and on down the list. Moreover, here's another way to look at it. How about this? Jon Jones, already in the Hall of Fame, is going to go in again. Gustafsson, Hall of Fame. I don't know if he'll go in again on a different track, because obviously there's different ways you can get in. I think he got in for the fight. Daniel Cormier, if he's not already in the Hall of Fame, he certainly will be. Rashad Evans, already in the Hall of Fame. Glover Teixeira, previous champion. Anthony Johnson, I don't know if he's in it at all. Phil Davis won't make it. Dan Henderson, I believe, is already in for his fight against Shogun. Ryan Bader won't make it. Shogun already in the Hall of Fame. Ovid St. Preux won't make it. Manuel Cavalcante, by the way, the only guy to ever stop Yoel Romero is on that list. And then Vitor Belfort, he might be on the list. I'm not sure. You have multiple guys, multiple entrants in multiple ways into the UFC Hall of Fame. You have credentialed Olympians, credentialed Division I athletes, multiple previous champions. So there was obviously some parity there as well. And then multiple entrants into the UFC Hall of Fame, all on this list at the exact same time. By any measurement you want, this was an enormously credentialed crowd. Now, that's not to say that there aren't things you could nitpick about, or fair criticisms even, about this list. For example, Gustafsson was very hot and cold. Sometimes he was on, sometimes he was off. It was hard to know. We keep going down the list. Even a guy like Shogun, he last was champion in 2011. He was certainly a bit more of a declined version of himself by 2014. About that, there can simply be no doubt. Ryan Bader had some ugly losses along the way. The Jon Jones one wasn't so bad. The Tito Ortiz one was kind of bad. Okay, fair enough. Certainly, Fabio Maldonado being on this list doesn't add necessarily a whole lot to it. Neither does Feijão, who is Rafael Cavalcante, although he does have that nice win over Yoel Romero from Strikeforce. And then Jimmy Manuel obviously was a good fighter in his time, but nothing especially historically remarkable in that way. There's things you can nitpick all up and down as what kind of state was Rashad in by 2014, blah, 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 though he was still pretty good at that point. You get the idea. It's not to say that this is above reproach. There are criticisms you can make, but holy Jesus, how do you not see at a bare minimum, the level of athletic talent is clearly superior than what we have today? And I know a lot of folks don't want to accept this. They're like, Nikita Krylov would beat these guys standing. Nikita Krylov would get wrestled into the dirt by guys like Phil Davis and Ryan Bader. Those guys didn't get a lot of fanfare because their styles weren't necessarily all that exciting, but they were tough guys, generally speaking, to beat. And they had tough styles to beat. And these were guys who had been competitive athletes in composite sports with deep amateur systems for long stretches of their life before they ever got to MMA. That's true for Dan Henderson. That's true for Rashad Evans. That's true for Jon Jones. That's true for Daniel Cormier. That's true for Rumble Johnson to an extent. He wasn't as credentialed, but he certainly has a bit of a background. And I can go on down the list from there. You have guys who have been competitive athletes at a very high level for long durations of their youth and their early adulthood before they ever even got to MMA. And those who went to MMA a little bit earlier had deep credentials before ever coming to the UFC. It's not a perfect division. It's not the best I've ever seen this division, but this is a good window into what we're talking about when we talk about 205 pounds being in decline. Now, let's compare that to what we have today at 205 pounds. And I don't want to be disparaging about any one talent. Some of these guys are coming back from injury. Some of them I think are still figuring out their place. But just look at the difference. Okay, so at the top we have Alex Pereira. No criticisms, right? Like 10 out of 10. The guy's amazing, right? I don't know how much he's been tested against, what 2014 kind of wrestlers would have given him. But nevertheless, he's kicking ass and taking names. I'm not complaining. One is Yuri Prochazka. I do think Yuri has all the athleticism in the world, but the guy's style is wide open. He went tooth and nail with a very old Glover Teixeira. It's very hard for me to believe he would have been able to stop the takedowns of Phil Davis with Phil in his prime. Then you got Magomed Ankalaev, a good fighter, but extremely inconsistent. Jamal Hill, yeah, okay, coming back from injury. It's, he's been up and down. Former champion, certainly can strike, but he's been up and down, obviously dealing with a lot of different factors in terms of just being able to be healthy this whole time. Jan Blachowicz definitely got better than he was in 2014. He's 41 years old now. I don't know that that's the best statement that he is inside the top 5 at 41 years of age. Alexander Rakic, a good, strong, very physical athlete, well-rounded. I do think he would have success against any of the 2014 roster for sure, but I don't think he'd be champion in that era. I don't even know if he'd get a title shot in that era. Nikita Krylov, I think, would get run over. Then you got Volkan Oezdemir, who certainly gave DC a bit of a tough fight for sure, and then he fell on hard times, and he's back now. I do think he's very good. He's had a couple great wins in a row. We'll see what's happening with him. He's got great striking. And again, he's got some of those modern best practices that are going to allow him to do really well. But we're talking about guys who have premium athletic skill and the kind of suffocating wrestling that is just insanely difficult to deal with. I think Oezdemir would be very competitive with them. But, you know, we're short on names here that can really match up. Khalil Roundtree certainly doing well for himself of this late stage. Obviously got a setback with the tainted supplements. We'll see a devastating striker, but again, Phil Davis might not have been exciting, but Phil probably would have given him a big problem, I think, at a bare minimum. Johnny Walker, just kind of a mess, to be quite honest. Carlos Ulberg certainly has a lot of athletic talent and speed, a dynamic fighter on the feet. But again, we're talking about an era where you had guys who had really lights out kind of athleticism in wrestling. It would be tough. Anthony Smith, I certainly have a great degree of respect for, but he's certainly getting older as well. And then from down there, it doesn't even matter anymore. Reyes had his time, but, you know, it's certainly fallen on hard times. And it goes on from there. There are gems on both rosters. There are some duds on both rosters. There's definitely stuff you can nitpick in July of 2014 where now looks better. And there's stuff you can say, certainly of this roster, you know, it's not that great, but how representative of it is the larger whole. There's plenty of caveats in either direction. No argument, no contest, certainly fair, true. But I'm telling you, you don't see any former Olympians on this roster. Pereira might end up going into the Hall of Fame. I don't know who else on this list is going to end up in the Hall of Fame. No one on this list was a credentialed wrestler at the highest level of American folk style in scholastic wrestling anyway. You don't see that. You don't see anyone who was like a dominant force on another sort of well, that's not quite true. I think Yuri Prochazka was something of a strong force in other places he fought, but he didn't have quite the same credentials that obviously like a Shogun Hua would have. But I go back to it again. Multiple entrants into the UFC Hall of Fame. Multiple Olympic teams made sort of over the course of it between Cormier and Henderson. And on down the list. The best ever, the second best ever. Dude, this is a diminished division. A diminished division. You just have to be honest about it. It doesn't mean the guys who are competing today can't get a lot better, and there's some turnover and some fresh blood, and guys begin to get win streaks, and what like there's still plenty of possibility about what could be in the future. About that, there can be no doubt. Fine. But where we are today, how can you look at this and then look at the July of 2014 light heavyweight rankings and think that there's no discernible difference between the two? There's a massive difference between the two. Now, again, in part, it's because some of the best practices have gotten better, and so you don't see the same dominating forces of wrestlers that you once did. But you do see some wrestlers coming over from college, but when was the last time a guy of Phil Davis's makeup made his way into MMA? Somebody who was a Division I national champion at, I think he was 197 pounds, from the best school basically right now in all of folk style wrestling in Penn State. When was the last time we had a prospect like that come over? When was the last time we had somebody who made an Olympic team for anything come over? It's a difference, folks. It's a massive difference. You must acknowledge that. So that's not to say that there can't be good fights made at 205. It's not to say that, again, a guy like Rakic could have great success. Again, Yuri Prochazka's 31 years old, man. If he really commits himself to doing something, I think he could be phenomenal. But where we are now versus where we are then, the only way to say that there's no drop-off or there's no difference is to simply be in denial. There's a huge one. This is not fully representative of the change in UFC from then to now. I can only speak about the light heavyweight division. But as it relates to 205 pounds, you got to be blind to not notice that there is a massive drop-off.